Well, Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. And I rise to give my support on motion 503 put forward by the Honourable Member for Whitecourt St. Anne. And the motion calls for government to consider establishing a task force to review legislation and programs related to child exploitation. And I certainly appreciate the member's concerns for the welfare of children because I probably spent my entire working life working with children and the vulnerable, from being a drug and alcohol counsellor, Mr. Speaker, to the private member bill I brought forward on the protection of children involved in the Prostitution Act, which, Mr. Speaker, was a first in North America, and passed in this legislation after the former Premier from Calgary, Albo, called me one day and told me that he was bringing it from a private member bill to bringing it to Bill 1 in this legislature, which is probably one of the proudest moments I've had as a sitting MLA. As it was indicated earlier, PCHIP, as it got to be known, recognized that children in the sex trade are actually victims of sexual abuse, and gives them the support that they need, establishing safe houses so that they can receive emergency care, treatment, and assessment for long-term changes in their lives. It's a bill that aggressively pursued the predators. Penalties for pimps and John included fines up to $25,000 and jail time. In my time as the Solicitor General, Mr. Speaker, I was proud to guide two very important initiatives through the legislature. The high-risk offender website, and brought the Amber Alert to Canada, first in Alberta, and then worked very diligently to bring it forward to the rest of the provinces in Canada. And now it's Canadian-wide. And the goal behind that is knowledge is the power to ensuring community safety. And when you have a high-risk offender leave a correctional facility for the community, local residents can and will be notified if the child is abducted. It doesn't necessarily have to be a high-risk offender. It could be a parent, and very, very strict criteria when we issue an Amber Alert. Alberta was proud to be the first province in Canada when a child goes missing. From there, we went to Children's Services and brought forward another piece of legislation that was a first in the country, was the Drug Endangered Children Act. And this act made it clear that children exposed to serious drug activities by the victims are victims of child abuse, and they need to be taken out of houses where there's toxic chemicals that are endangering their health. In 2009, Mr. Speaker, I was pleased to have tabled and guided amendments to the Protection of the Children Abusing Drug Act. And these amendments were extending the time that a child could stay in treatment, and I was very proud at that particular time as a progressive conservative to be able to bring these amendments forward. What I can't understand, Mr. Speaker, is the lack of progress of child exploitation in the last few years. Mr. Speaker, the former Justice Minister and the member from Calgary, Albo, stood up and gave a very, very passionate speech about what she believes needs to be done in this province, and how she visions things. And what I find ironic, to be very honest with you, is it's the same minister that when we passed the mandatory reporting of child pornography in this legislature as a member of the Wild Rose, and it did pass in this legislation, under her guidance and leadership, did not proclaim the bill. The same minister was aware of the PCHIP legislation and the amendments that were passed in this legislature. The same minister as Justice has not guided that amendment or that piece of legislation through. Quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, I find it quite unacceptable, some of the legislation that has been put in this House that hasn't been passed in recent time. And I alluded to the PCHED legislation, and we all know that children who are abusing drugs are probably one of the highest risk and most vulnerable in regards to sexual exploitation. and they need to be clean, they need to be sober so that they can get their life on track. And to this date, 2 years later, it still hasn't been proclaimed. And these are laws that are going to help our children who are very, very vulnerable. They need to get the help that we've promised. I am very proud to be able to stand up and support the motion from the member for Whitecourt St. Anne, because quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, I know his heart's in the right place. And I know of anybody in this particular legislation or in this particular legislature, he's one that will push to get the job done. And I'm extremely proud to be able to say that, because I have gotten to know him over the last several years, and I know when he puts his mind to something, he gets it done. So it's important that this motion pass, and it's important, as he alluded to, he's a dad, he's a granddad with 2 young girls, and I think he realizes how quickly the world is changing and how quickly sexual exploitation is changing. We've got cell phone sex, we've got truck stop sex. I have trouble trying to even keep up with some of the stuff that is currently going on in this world, but like the member from Calgary Varsity, I can tell you, I get the calls. The police refer people to me. Parents call. We're in a similar situation where we're dealing with a young lady that's 15 and we're dealing with a young man that's 12. Finding them is one thing. Getting them help is another. And trying to get them into a secure treatment facility. And the wonderful, wonderful, wonderful people within the Department of Children and Family Services have tried all they can to get these children help. And while they're able to get them some sort of help, it's like the honourable member mentioned Form 1 in regards to dealing with some of their mental illness, whether it's from a psychiatrist or a psychologist. All of these things can be done to protect our children. So I hope that this motion passes. Quite frankly, I hope the member from Whitecourt St. Anne has is given the task of chairing this particular task force. I know that he's one member in this legislature that will research what's going around not only in this country, but what's new, what's innovative, what the children need to do, what needs to be done to help the children. Because when I was, and I always hate to use this terminology, working the streets, because everybody all of a sudden thinks that, you were involved in prostitution. But I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, I spent thousands of hours on the street, meeting with kids, establishing relationships with the kids, being able to sit down and have a coffee with them, share a smoke, have a pizza with them, and find out exactly what their thoughts were. A compelling story for me is a young lady that we picked up under Peachup for the 13th time. And she was shooting coke between her toes. And I thought this is one of the ones that we're probably going to have to write off. Well, whatever clicked for the 13th time worked. And I was so, and they tell you not to get involved in these particular situations because your heart gets torn away by these kids so often. Anyhow, I decided to follow this young lady. Had her join us at Children's Services because she was doing so well, so that she could bring her stories to other children that were dealing with the same situation. Finally brought together a task force when we were reviewing the Peachup legislation, what was right, what was wrong, and invited her to come, and then she asked me if she could speak. And we'd never put any of the kids front and center because that's not what our job, our role was to use them. And I said, if that's what you want, you're more than welcome to be able to do that. 350 people at this conference, and we're talking hardcore cops that have been around forever. people within the justice, and she told her stories about how she got involved.
The